NCERT is that it's riddled with factual inaccuracies, the class 8th textbook. I am yet to do a very detailed analysis of the entire book, but from the preliminary reports that I've seen in the Indian Express, the Hindu, etc., I've been able to glean firstly that they've really misrepresented the history of jizya. First of all, this idea that jizya was somehow a tool for conversion is completely a misrepresented figment of imagination. I think NCERT is perhaps reading many medieval Islamic literature literally to come to this conclusion. Because if you look at how the jizya was actually imposed throughout medieval India, there is nowhere even a single iota of this idea that somehow we are imposing this so that people could convert. Even when it was first put to practical use in 634 AD by Caliph Omar in Iraq, Iran, and Levant, where the non-Muslim population of these three areas were subject to jizya. There also, conversion, for example, was a very difficult thing. You couldn't just convert by, say, oh, I don't want to pay the jizya, so can I just convert to Islam? In fact, conversion at that point in time was very difficult. Marshall Hodge, etc., have written about this, and they say that if you wanted to, if somebody wanted to convert to Islam at that point of time, they had to first get in touch with an Arab, a Muslim Arab, and then be taken by that Arab as a mawali, which means a client. And then that client would be taught, the basic teachings of Islam, and only then could he convert. So there is no such idea that somehow conversion was a very easy process and that jizya was an incentive to convert, etc. That is completely unfounded, right? So where is NCERT getting this information from? Which practical source has ever documented that there were these 5 people who came to us in Sultanate period or in Mughal India who said, sir, we don't want to pay jizya, so could we just convert to Islam instead? So I don't think that has ever happened. And also, this deliberate misrepresentation of when Akbar first repeals the jizya is also very sad. He never first repeals the jizya in his later years. He first repeals the jizya just 3 years after he comes to the throne. I think a lot of people are very confused, or maybe even NCERT is confused, and if it is, that's very shocking that Akbar's reign starts from 1556 onwards. That's actually not true, because from 1556 to 1560, he was still under the regency of his guardian, Bairam Khan. And from 1560 onwards is when he becomes the emperor proper. And within 3 years, it's one of his first decisions that he takes as an emperor is to repeal the jizya as well as the pilgrimage tax, the Hajj tax. Both of them are stopped. And the reason given for it in the Ain-e-Akbari is that both of them are regarded by the emperor as discriminatory taxes. So again, NCERT is completely misrepresenting this history of the jizya, and one wonders why. They also go ahead and sort of downplay this thing, which I think Iqtidar Alam Khan in his paper is very very astutely observed as to how, starting with Akbar, there is a steady rise of non-Muslim population as mansabdars, in the mansabdari system. And I think that's a very interesting observation. That has also been misrepresented in the NCERT, somehow this idea that, oh, well, Hindus were in a minority. Well, I think what the NCERT is not able to look at is the context in which the non-Muslim population is entering the Mughal service. And for that time, it's actually pretty high, right? So 16%, I think, under Akbar is the Rajputs, and I think around 22% is the total non-Muslim population. And then the Rajput percentage increases to 33% under the under Aurangzeb's reign, right? So there is this deliberate idea that we are going to create this idea that somehow everything that so far has been regarded as, say, a paragon of Akbar's cosmopolitanism will be deliberately attacked by the NCERT. They bring out in his 45 years of reign just one particular incident of the siege of Chittor, and say that, this is what has made him very brutal. So I think that clearly shows that NCERT is trying too hard to portray even somebody like Akbar, who's even the popular sphere regarded as a very cosmopolitan ruler, that, even he was so brutal. That's how brutal the Mughals were. I think that's very interesting to see that the NCERT is doing that. Apart from the factual inaccuracies, the NCERT goes all out to also remove the history of two very fascinating women in medieval India. They have completely removed Razia, Sultan Razia, and Noor Jahan. Now, I don't know why they have done that. And it's very sad because you see, as a student a school student of history, when you're looking at history and you see a host of male emperors, it's really nice and refreshing to find that, well, there were a couple of odd female emperors as well. One of which is, of course, Sultan Razia, who was an emperor a sultan in her own right. She ruled from 1236 to 1240. She has so many achievements in her name. She diplomatically warded off a Mongol invasion. She minted coins in her name. Her former title being Sultan Razia wa Dola wa Din. And then she even started, so in the first couple of years of her reign, she was ruling behind a screen so as to not show her face to everybody. But then she even removes that and she removes her parda. She wears the clothes that the Sultan would have worn, the kuba and the kula. And she goes out, rides the elephant, etc., conducts her business. She also tries to very diplomatically outmaneuver the many machinations against her plotted and hatched by the Turkish Bandagan, who was an all-male coterie of these very powerful nobles, which were actually inculcated by her own father, Sultan al-Tutmish. But Razia somehow tries to keep them at bay for as long as she can. So I think all of this actually deserves a lot of space in the NCERT, because I think for female students reading this will be such an inspiring read. But somehow they have decided to completely remove Sultan Razia. Um, Another very interesting way to look at Razia perhaps could have been that, even though she had so much to her name and so many achievements to her name, for example, Juzjani, the contemporary chronicler of Sultan Razia, in his Tabakat-e-Nasiri, calls her Sultan Razia Lashkarkash, which means a war leader, somebody who leads her army into war. Um, Later on, of course, the later sources depict her in a very negative light and judge her through very patriarchal lens. So it would have been very interesting for the NCERT to probably bring out as to why, she was being looked at through such a patriarchal lens and not for her achievements, so on and so forth. This could have been a very interesting case study in how women's histories, when they are written by men, are written very significantly differently than, what the woman's history actually is. But I think NCERT has completely lost that opportunity and completely removed Sultan Razia. They've also removed Noor Jahan, who was, again, a very fascinating person. She was the de facto emperor of the Mughal Empire from 1621 to 1627, when Jahangir was very ill. She was an excellent hunt. She was an excellent hunter. She was somebody who, is said to have innovated a lot of sartorial innovations, like the silver brocade, which is the badla, silver lace, which is kinari. She is said to have innovated dudami, which is this lady's gown. Also the panchtolia, which was this lighter version of the orini. And then she was an excellent poetess as well. She was somebody who also had, her name on the coin next to that of the emperor. And then she also controlled the Muhuruzuk, the royal stamp of the Mughals, and passed a lot of the farmans, right? So I think to remove, such powerful women who wielded power, Noor Jahan had so much money at her disposal, and the way she used it to build sarais, etc. All of this would have made for a very interesting, refreshing read. Anyway, women in Indian history or histories anyway are so few and far between, especially models of powerful women. To remove them is complete injustice to the history of women. And I have no idea why NCERT has gone and done that. I think my only reason seems to be that in NCERT's mind, powerful women could have not existed in the paragon in the paradigm of these Muslim rulers and the Muslim period, quote unquote. So therefore, they have sort of removed these two exceptions so that they could just prove to us that the Mughals were actually very bad and they treated women badly, this, that, and the other. There were no empowered women. So I think it's very sad. I don't know if they've also included other very fascinating women like Chand Bibi, etc., in the Deccan. But to remove these fascinating examples of women who are wielding power and a very refreshing interregnum of this female polity that comes across. It's kind of sad that NCERT has sort of removed that as well. Another thing that I have a problem with is this value judgment that the NCERT tries to put when it comes to only the class 8 textbook. This, use of the words like brutal and cruel willy-nilly without actually defining what brutality means and what cruelty means, and without using it for any other ruler. It's very fascinating that they have not used the same words to describe, say, a Chola ruler like Rajendra Chola, who, fights against the Chalukya ruler, burns his capital called Manekheta. His inscription says so many women and children died. So many women and children were kidnapped before the city was burned. But somehow he is not brutal. But Akbar is brutal, Babur is brutal, Aurangzeb is brutal, and they're all cruel. But no other ruler, no other non-Muslim ruler has been described as brutal and cruel. So it's, you don't have to actually look much further to see what NCERT is trying to do and what its agenda is. So I think that's very fascinating that they've sort of decided to use words like this. It also sort of reeks of a lack of objectivity, because if you are trying to create a textbook for students, you want to be as objective as possible and stay away from as many value judgments as possible. You don't want to use words like brutal and cruel. These are conclusions that students should be able to, if they want to, or if they have to come to this conclusion, they can do so by themselves. You don't have to actually use these terms again and again and again. So it's very clear that the NCERT has a preconceived notion of the Mughal rulers as being brutal and cruel, and they want students to know this. And therefore, they've just sort of peppered these words all around, the class 8 textbook where they discuss the Mughals and their brutality. None of the other rulers have their quote-unquote brutality discussed. In fact, I think there's a very fascinating HT report which says that they have removed this entire campaign of the Marathas from 1741 to 1751 against Bengal, which was marked by a lot of brutality, a lot of overtaxation. There are even Bengali poems written about it, Chele Ghumalo, Parajolaro, Borgialo Deshe, Bulbulite Dhan Khaiche Khajna Debo Kishe, which basically talks about how the Borgi have come when everybody has sort of slept and they're all silent. And, they are overtaxing us, but the bird has eaten, the grain. So how are we going to pay the taxes? So none of this brutality finds itself. And the HT reporter, very kudos to him, he asked that person, the person who's, by the way, I will speak about him, the person who's the social science curricular head of the NCERT, Michael Danino, a very interesting figure. I'll talk about him later. When he was asked as to why you've removed this particular bit of Maratha brutality, they said that they don't want to overburden the students. So it's fascinating that Akbar's siege of Chittor and the details, the gory details that the NCERT gives about it, is not going to overburden the student. But 10 years of Maratha brutality against the Bengalis is certainly going to overburden students. So we're going to remove that. So I think there's no longer a pretense left of the NCERT. NCERT at one point of time was at least pretending that they are trying to be objective and they're trying to, restructure this with some semblance of objectivity in mind. That I think is completely gone out of the window. The NCERT is very clear about this, that they have an agenda and they're putting this across.